What's up, Chiefs Kingdom? Noah Gray here, tight end for the Kansas City Chiefs. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe to Josh's channel and check out showmefootball.com for more.
Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to another video on my channel. My name is Josh Fan of showmefootball.com and arrowheadaddict.com, and it feels awesome to be back making another video for you guys. I know it's been a while, but I actually have been pretty busy lately. In fact, for those of you that didn't know, I actually got married a couple weeks ago. So that happened, and I've just had a lot going on right now, and some of the other things that come with getting married. I've been busy running around doing stuff like that, but also it's just a slow time in the off season, man. Like, once the draft is over, you really start to hit a wall when it comes to content and stuff, and there's only so much you can talk about as far as the draft picks and how they're going to do, and unless we have another signing, then there's not that much to talk about, and there's a couple potential signings that could happen, but we're not really here to talk about that. I wanted to make a video reacting to yesterday's news that now former Kansas City Chiefs defensive end Frank Clark is signing a one-year deal with the Denver Broncos to stay in the AFC West and face the Chiefs twice next year. So this move caught a lot of people off guard. It wasn't impossible that Frank Clark was going to sign with another team that wasn't the Chiefs, but it's like a lot of people see that news and they go, oh, come on, Frank. The Broncos? You had to go to the Denver Broncos? And I think that's what a lot of the reaction to this signing was. I don't think fans are so upset that Frank Clark is no longer on the Chiefs. It's the fact that he went to the Broncos. But I wanted to give you guys my opinion on this, especially as someone that has been honestly Frank Clark's biggest hater over the last few years since he's been on the Chiefs. I've been one of Frank Clark's biggest critics since he's joined the team in 2019. I've always thought he was overrated. I've always thought he underperformed here. And honestly, you look at the totality of his career here in Kansas City, I know people are going to talk about his playoff performance, but he was an average player for the majority of his tenure in Kansas City. And even in the playoffs, I thought a lot of his performance was overrated. I thought he was a big beneficiary of playing next to Chris Jones. Even in this past postseason, I think Chris Jones played a huge part in some of the sacks that he was able to get. But I'll probably touch on that a little bit later. So, initial reaction with Frank Clark going to the Denver Broncos. First, LOL, laugh out loud. Honestly, it's hilarious to me. Secondly, I'm glad the Frank Clark saga is over, because when the Chiefs cut Frank Clark, I figured that was the end. Like, there's no way he comes back now, right? Because first off, the reason that he was cut was because he refused to restructure, or him and the Chiefs couldn't come to terms on an agreement to restructure his contract. And the Chiefs were just like, no, we're not keeping you for that amount of money. I'm sorry, we have to release you. And when the Chiefs released Frank Clark, they ate about $7 million in dead cap. I wrote an article about a month ago on the potential of Frank Clark's return to the Kansas City Chiefs, because it was something that people still talked about happening even after he was cut and everything. Maybe Frank Clark could still come back. And Chris Jones had stirred up Chiefs Kingdom by putting out tweets saying, re-sign Frank Clark. I want my dog Frank Clark back and all this stuff. And fans were trying to explore all these different avenues in which Frank Clark could come back to the Kansas City Chiefs for another year and all this stuff. And honestly, it was just tiring for me, because I thought it was time to move on from Frank Clark. I was pretty sure the Chiefs felt the exact same way. But I wrote that article, and in that article I explained why it's not as easy as people were saying to re-sign Frank Clark. And I talked about how they were already paying him $7 million not to be on the team. And people were saying, oh, it's a sunk cost fallacy. And I tried to tell people that the $7 million that they're already paying him does play a factor in negotiations, because the Chiefs were telling Frank Clark, hey, we're already paying you this money. We don't have that much cap space. If you come back to play for us, it's going to be very cheap. And there were always going to be other teams that were willing to pay more for Frank Clark. Everyone was just assuming that Frank Clark wanted to come back on the veteran minimum deal to play with the Kansas City Chiefs for one more deal. I don't know if you guys saw the contract he got from the Denver Broncos. It's up to $7.5 million. That's a lot more than the veterans minimum. People were just assuming that Frank Clark was going to come back for the veterans minimum. I think if it wasn't about money to Frank Clark, he would have taken a restructure to stay here to begin with. Frank Clark has always struck me as a guy who thinks he's worth probably more than he is, or thinks he's worth more than the veterans minimum. And yeah, maybe his price came down a little bit this late in free agency, but also this late in free agency, players do have somewhat of a leverage play still. I mean, you look at Jadeveon Clowney, that guy has gotten double-digit million-dollar contracts the last few years by just waiting to sign with the team in June every single year. And so I never understood the confidence from Chiefs fans that Frank Clark was just going to agree to come back for cheap. Secondly, Frank Clark is a guy that every year he was with Kansas City, he played 70% or more of the defensive snaps. With the other investments that the Chiefs had made into their defensive end position, there was no scenario in which you could bring Frank Clark back to play for 70% of the snaps. Everyone agrees that Frank Clark would have been better suited as a rotational rusher, but once again, people were assuming that Frank Clark wanted to sign up to do that. Again, Frank Clark strikes me as a guy that thinks of himself more than a rotational rusher, and if you look at the Denver Broncos depth chart, Frank Clark's probably going to start for them. I don't think you can say the same for here. I don't think Frank Clark could have started for you. I think Charles Omenihu is better than him. I think he would have started. And then you have George Karlaftis on the other side. Like, you're not going to bump him down for Frank Clark. And then you got to remember, you just invested a first-round pick into Felix Anudike-Uzomah. I just didn't see how Frank Clark fit into that rotation. That's not to say I don't see the Chiefs adding another edge rusher to make you feel better about this group. Maybe they still add a veteran. Maybe they bring back, I don't know, Carlos Dunlap or someone like that. I'm not saying they can't do that, but I'm saying Frank Clark isn't really the guy, I think, to do that with, and I don't think Frank Clark wants to sign up for that. I think he's going to start for the Broncos, and he wanted another starting opportunity. I don't think that was here for him in Kansas City. So that combined with the financials, it wasn't very easy to bring back Frank Clark. There would have been a lot of compromises that both Frank Clark and the Chiefs would have had to make for that to happen. And also, again, you look at the deal that he signed with Denver. The Chiefs can't afford that right now, guys. The Chiefs don't even have enough cap space. They barely have enough cap space for like a veteran minimum contract. They're near the bottom of the league in cap space. And yes, the cap, for the most part, is non-existent. You can make moves to free up cap space, but until they make a move to free up cap space, there's no point in talking about this stuff. Like DeAndre Hopkins is another one. I made a video on him recently, but that was before he got released. He's released now. Kansas City Chiefs fans want DeAndre Hopkins. The Chiefs can't afford DeAndre Hopkins because DeAndre Hopkins is out for a payday right now. It's very clear when you look at the visits that he's taking, teams to like the Titans and the Patriots. It's very clear that the Chiefs don't have the money for DeAndre Hopkins, and until they make a move like, for example, extending Chris Jones, they're not really going to be able to sign anybody else. The Donovan Smith contract that they gave him, that kind of ate up most of their cap space that they had left over after the draft. So until they make a move to free up cap space, it's really pointless talking about any of this stuff. Frank Clark was never coming back to the Chiefs. They didn't have the money for it. And I knew there was always going to be a team out there willing to pay Frank Clark just a little bit more. And those teams weren't already on the hook for $7 million for Frank Clark, so they're more comfortable offering him more money. Frank Clark makes the most money by going to another team. Frank Clark was always going to be sacrificing more money to stay with the Chiefs. And the Chiefs were already paying him some money. Now another team throwing in $7 million. Frank Clark is making $14 million next year, basically. If he makes that full $7.5 million from the Broncos, and he makes the $7 million from the Chiefs he's already getting, you know, that's $14 million. The Chiefs can't pay him that. They were never going to pay him that. But yeah, guys, I mean, Frank Clark to the Broncos, I mean, yeah, there's a little bit of a sting factor that he signs with the AFC West rival, sure. But Frank Clark doesn't, I mean, like, guys, Frank Clark, I'm not a fan of Frank Clark. Like, he's a 4-sack guy. He's a 3 or 4 or 5-sack guy, maybe, at this point in his career. Mediocre pressure rate. It doesn't move me. Like, Frank Clark doesn't scare me. And I'm almost excited to see Chiefs fans when Frank Clark has like 4 sacks for the Broncos next year, and Chiefs fans are saying he sucks, even though that's exactly what he did over here. Frank Clark doesn't scare me, guys. And some people could have said before, well, maybe Frank Clark is a little bit of a threat because he's familiar with our offensive line, but that's not really the case anymore. The Chiefs have 2 new tackles. Andrew Wiley is gone. Orlando Brown is gone. So even when Frank Clark faces the Chiefs, it's going to be a matchup that he hasn't seen before, really. Or I should say a matchup that he wouldn't be as familiar with because the Chiefs have different tackles this time around. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on Frank Clark signing with the Denver Broncos. I honestly I'm fine with it. It doesn't move me. I'm not concerned with Frank Clark. Cool, he can go play for the Broncos. And for those of you that buy into the whole playoff Frank Clark stigma, Denver's not going to make the playoffs. So basically, Frank Clark is useless to them. But yeah, guys, those are my thoughts, but I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on Frank Clark signing with the Denver Broncos? Does it make you look at him any differently? What are your guys' thoughts? Would love to hear from you. But with all that being said, make sure you like, share, and subscribe so more Chiefs fans can find this. And make sure you check out my work on showmefootball.com and arrowheadaddict.com. I will see you all in the next one. Go Chiefs!